They brought a cart filled with golden spurs to the battlefield. They were so certain of victory that they had already decided how to celebrate. They were the superpowers of the Middle Ages, the French nobility, the best equipped, wealthiest, and most arrogant fighting force in Europe. Across the field stood their enemy, a small broken army of Englishmen. They were starving. They were sick with dysentery. Many were barefoot, shivering in the freezing October rain. The French commanders looked at them and laughed. They outnumbered the English 5-1. They believed this would not be a battle, but a hunt, a sport for gentlemen to wipe out a band of peasants. But history is not written by the size of your army. It is written by the strength of your spirit. Within 3 hours, that magnificent French army would cease to exist. The flower of their knighthood would be lying face down in the mud, suffocating in their own blood, slaughtered by the very peasants they despised. How did a group of exhausted, low-born archers destroy the medieval equivalent of a tank division? How did arrogance lead an empire to total ruin? This is the story of the Battle of Agincourt. It is a lesson in hubris, a masterclass in strategy, and a warning that echoes through the centuries to the present day. Welcome to Indomitable history. Let us step into the mud. To understand why this day became a graveyard for the French elite, we must first look at the men who led them there. On one side was Henry V of England. He was 28 years old, a hardened soldier who bore a gruesome scar on his face from an arrow wound he received as a teenager. He was a man with everything to prove. His father had usurped the throne, stealing it by force, and many in Europe viewed Henry not as a rightful king, but as the son of a criminal. He needed a war to unite his country. He needed a victory to prove that God was on his side. Opposing him was the Kingdom of France, a nation that was, on paper, the greatest power in the Western world. It had more people, more money, and more land than England. But France was a giant with a rotting head. Its king, Charles VI, was insane. He suffered from bouts of madness so severe that he sometimes believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. With the king incapacitated, the French nobles turned on each other like wolves. Two rival factions, the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, were practically fighting a civil war for control of the country. They hated each other almost as much as they hated the English. But when Henry landed on their shores, they put aside their quarrels for just one moment. They united not out of patriotism, but out of greed. They saw the English invasion as a chance for glory, a chance to capture wealthy prisoners, and a chance to prove their superiority. Henry had arrived in France in August of 1415 with a grand fleet and a strong army. He laid siege to the port city of Harfleur. He expected a quick victory. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. The city refused to surrender. The summer heat was unbearable. The marshes around the city were breeding grounds for disease. Before long, a killer far more efficient than the French army began to stalk the English camp. Dysentery. The men called it the bloody flux. It turned the English army into a hospital ward. Soldiers were dying by the hundreds, literally shitting themselves to death in the mud. By the time the city finally fell in late September, Henry's grand army was ruined. He had lost a third of his men to sickness. Winter was coming. His supplies were running low. His advisors begged him to go home. They told him to sail back to England and return next year. But Henry refused. To return home with nothing but a captured port and a dead army would look like defeat. It would weaken his hold on the throne. He made a decision that seemed borderline suicidal. He announced that he would march his remaining troops, the sick, the hungry, and the exhausted, over 100 miles across the French countryside to the port of Calais, an English stronghold. It was a show of defiance. He was parading his banner through the heart of enemy territory, daring the French to stop him. And the French accepted the dare. As Henry marched north, the French nobility began to gather. Word spread from castle to castle that the English king was trapped. The French army grew with every passing day. Dukes, counts, and barons summoned their knights. They polished their armor, sharpened their swords, and rode out to crush the invaders. They moved faster than the English, shadowing them, cutting off their supplies, and destroying the bridges across the rivers. For weeks, the English army was forced to march inland, searching desperately for a place to cross the River Somme. They were running out of food. The soldiers were reduced to eating nuts, berries, and raw vegetables they scrounged from the fields. The dysentery had not stopped. Men were collapsing on the side of the road, left behind to die or be captured by angry French peasants. They were wet, they were filthy, and they were terrified. But they kept marching, driven forward by the iron will of their king. Finally, Henry outmaneuvered the French and found a crossing. But the delay had been costly. The French army had time to swell to massive proportions. On the 24th of October, near a small village called Agincourt, the trap finally snapped shut. Henry's scouts rode over a hill and saw a sight that would have frozen the blood of any man. The way to Calais was blocked. Spreading across the fields was a forest of banners and lances. The French army was waiting. The contrast between the two forces could not have been starker. The French were fresh, well-fed, and rested. They were led by the Constable of France and the highest nobles of the land. Their army was built around the heavy cavalry, thousands of knights encased in full-plate armor. This was the pinnacle of medieval technology. A knight in full plate was a walking tank, impervious to most sword cuts, terrifying to behold. They rode massive war horses, trained to trample and bite. They believed that no infantry force in the world could withstand their charge. But they suffered from a fatal flaw: arrogance. The French command structure was a mess. There was no single commander-in-chief because every duke and count considered himself too important to take orders from anyone else. They argued over who would command the vanguard, who would get the best position, and who would have the honor of capturing the English king. They looked at Henry's army and saw a pathetic rabble. They saw archers with no armor, men with bare feet and rags wrapped around their heads. In the medieval feudal system, a knight was a superior being. A peasant with a bow was nothing more than vermin. The idea that a noble knight could be killed by a commoner was not just unlikely to them, it was offensive. It violated the natural order of the world. This class prejudice was so deep that the French made a critical tactical error before the battle even began. They had their own crossbowmen, thousands of them. But the nobles sent them to the back of the line. They did not want the battle to be decided by shooting. They wanted to charge. They wanted to smash the English with their own hands. They wanted the glory for themselves. They pushed their own support troops out of the way so they could have a clear run at the enemy. On the other side of the field, the mood was very different. The English knew they were likely going to die the next day. But this fear gave them a clarity of purpose, and they possessed a weapon that the French did not fully understand: the longbow. This was not a simple hunting tool. The English war bow was a beast of yew wood, standing 6 feet tall. It required immense strength to use. The draw weight was between 100 and 150 pounds. To pull that string back to the ear required the same force as lifting a fully grown man with one arm. You did not learn to shoot a longbow in a few weeks. You started when you were a child. In England, laws were passed banning other sports like football on Sundays, so that every man would practice archery. The men standing in the English lines had skeletons that were literally deformed by years of practice. Modern archaeologists have found their remains. Their shoulders were thickened, their spines twisted from the immense pressure of the draw. They were not just soldiers, they were biological artillery. They could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute. With 5,000 archers, that meant the English could put 50,000 arrows into the air every 60 seconds. It was a storm of death. But against the high-quality steel plate of the French knights, even the longbow had its limits. The English arrows could penetrate chainmail, but they would struggle to punch through the breastplate of a wealthy noble. The French knew this. They believed their armor made them invincible. As night fell on the 24th of October, the rain began to pour. It was a torrential downpour that soaked the ploughed fields between the two armies. The ground, already soft from the autumn planting, turned into a soup of thick, sticky clay. In the French camp, the mood was like a festival. The nobles drank wine and feasted. Their pages polished their armor. They were so confident that they were literally rolling dice to see who would get the rights to ransom the English lords. They laughed and joked, the noise of their celebration drifting across the field. They sent a herald to Henry, asking him if he would like to surrender now and save himself the pain of defeat. Henry sent the herald back with a simple message. He would not surrender. In the English camp, there was silence. Henry had ordered that any man who made a noise would lose his horse or his right ear. He needed discipline. The men were cold, forbidden from lighting fires to keep warm because it would give away their positions. They sat in the mud, chewing on leather straps to stave off hunger, sharpening their arrowheads and making their peace with God. They confessed their sins to the priests, knowing that sunrise would likely bring their end. But while the French slept or parted, Henry was thinking. He walked among his men, not as a distant king, but as a captain. He checked the ground. He looked at the terrain. The battlefield the French had chosen was a narrow strip of open land, flanked on both sides by dense, ancient woodland. This was the Tramecourt and Agincourt woods. The distance between the two forests was less than 1,000 yards. Henry realized something the arrogant French commanders had missed. The narrow field meant the French could not use their numbers. They could not flank him. If they wanted to get to him, they would have to come straight down the middle. They would have to funnel their massive army into a tight bottleneck, and they would have to do it through the mud. Henry ordered his archers to do something strange. He told them to go into the woods and cut down 6-foot-long wooden stakes. He told them to sharpen both ends. These were not arrows. These were portable fortifications. The plan was simple and brutal. The archers would hammer these stakes into the ground in front of them, angled outward toward the enemy. It would create a bristling wall of wooden spikes. If the French cavalry charged, the horses would impale themselves on the stakes before they could reach the archers. As the sun began to rise on St. Crispin's Day, the rain stopped, but the damage was done. The field was a quagmire. The English stood up, stiff and cold. They took their positions. The men-at-arms, the heavy infantry, stood in the centre with the king. On the flanks, extending forward in a horseshoe shape, stood the archers. They hammered their stakes into the mud. They strung their bows. They looked across the field at the glittering wall of steel that was the French army. The French were slow to form up. They were hungover, tired, and struggling to move in the deep mud. Their armor weighed 50 to 60 pounds. Imagine strapping 3 heavy bags of cement to your body and trying to walk through a swamp. That is what the French knights faced. But they didn't care. They saw the tiny English force and smiled. They jostled for position in the front line, pushing and shoving, because everyone wanted to be in the first wave. Everyone wanted to be the first to strike a blow. They packed themselves in tight, shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee. The stage was set. On one side, the might of an empire, confident, heavy, and blind to the danger. On the other, a desperate band of brothers relying on a wooden stick and a piece of string. The air was thick with anticipation. The English waited. The French waited. For hours, nothing happened. The French were content to starve the English out. They had no reason to attack. Henry knew he could not wait. His men were starving. If he sat there for another day, his army would collapse from hunger. He had to force the issue. He had to make the French attack him. And so he gave an order that shocked everyone. "Banners, advance!" he shouted. The English army pulled their stakes out of the ground and began to walk forward. They marched right into the effective range of the French crossbows. It was a risk of massive proportions. If the French had charged at that moment, while the English were moving and defenseless, the battle would have been over in minutes. The English would have been trampled. But the French did nothing. They were too disorganized, too surprised, or perhaps too proud to attack an enemy that was moving. They watched as the English marched to within 300 yards, the extreme range of the longbow. The English stopped. The archers hammered their stakes back into the mud. They planted their feet. They looked at the massive, glittering target in front of them. Henry IV raised his hand. A signal was given. "Now strike." The order echoed down the line. 5,000 archers reached into their quivers, knocked their heavy war arrows, and pulled the strings back to their ears. The wood of the bows groaned under the tension. It was the sound of an empire about to crumble. The first volley was released. The sky turned black, and the slaughter began. The sound of thousands of arrows hitting their target was like the roar of a sudden hailstorm on a tin roof. The first volley didn't kill many knights. The distance was long, and the French plate armor was thick. But the arrows didn't need to kill the men to cause chaos. They hit the horses. The French cavalry, the pride of the nobility, was stationed on the flanks, ready to sweep in and crush the English archers. But a horse, unlike a knight, cannot be fully armored. The arrows plunged into the animals' chests and flanks. The effect was instantaneous pandemonium. Wounded horses, maddened by pain, bucked and reared. They threw their riders into the deep mud. They galloped backward, crashing into the ranks of the French infantry behind them, shattering the formation before the battle had even truly joined. Seeing the English arrows flying, the French commanders realized they could not just stand there and take it. They had to close the distance. They had to crush those peasants. The order was given to charge. The French plan was for the cavalry to ride down the archers, clearing the way for the main body of infantry to smash the English centre. But the mud had other ideas. A charge that was supposed to be a thunderous gallop was reduced to a slow, agonizing trot. The ground sucked at the horses' hooves. The knights spurred their mounts, but the beasts could barely move. As they crawled toward the English lines, the archers simply stepped up their rate of fire. They weren't aiming at individuals anymore. They were firing into the mass. The storm of arrows is not just a poetic phrase. It was a tactical reality. The arrows came in waves, darkening the sky, forcing the French knights to lower their heads. They had to close the visors of their helmets to protect their faces. This was critical. A knight with his visor down has a very narrow field of vision. He can only see what is directly in front of him. He can't see his flanks. He can't see the ground. He can barely breathe. The cavalry finally reached the English lines, but they didn't crash into them. They crashed into the stakes. The sharp wooden points impaled the horses' chests. The charge stopped dead. The knights were thrown from their saddles into the mud, weighed down by 60 pounds of steel. They tried to stand, slipping and sliding, while the English archers, safe behind their wall of stakes, shot them at point-blank range. This time, at close distance, the heavy bodkin arrowheads found the weak points in the armour: the armpits, the groin, the eye slits. The first wave of the French attack was destroyed, but the nightmare was only beginning. Behind the cavalry came the main French force, thousands of dismounted men-at-arms. These were the great dukes and counts, marching on foot because they wanted to be the ones to capture the English king. They saw the cavalry retreat and marched forward. But remember the terrain. The field was a funnel, narrowing as it approached the English line. The French army was huge, maybe 20 or 30,000 men deep. As they advanced, the men on the sides were pushed inward by the woods. The formation got tighter and tighter. They were pressing against each other. Then, they hit the mud that had been churned up by the cavalry. It was knee-deep now, a thick, freezing sludge mixed with blood and manure. The French knights slipped and stumbled, and all the while, the arrows kept falling. To protect themselves from the rain of death, the French lowered their heads and bunched together even tighter. They became a blind, unstoppable wall of steel, moving slowly toward the English centre. They crashed into the English line with the weight of a landslide. The initial impact was terrifying. The English line buckled. They were pushed back several feet by the sheer mass of the French advance. King Henry himself was in the thick of the fighting, defending his brother who had fallen. The king took a blow to his helmet that knocked off one of the gold ornaments on his crown. It was that close. But then, the physics of the crowd took over. The French in the front rank were fighting for their lives. But the French in the second, third, and fourth ranks were pushing forward, eager to get into the fight. They didn't know what was happening at the front. They just pushed. The men in the front were pinned. They couldn't lift their arms to swing their swords. They were pressed against the English shields, unable to move. And then they began to fall. Not from enemy weapons, but from exhaustion and the slippery ground. Once a knight in full armour fell in that crush, he could not get up. He was trampled by the men behind him. The pile of bodies began to grow. It became a wall of dead and dying men in front of the English line. The French kept pushing, climbing over their own fallen comrades to get at the enemy. It was a scene of pure horror. Men were suffocating, crushed by the weight of their own armour and the bodies of their friends. This is known as crush asphyxia. They weren't being stabbed. They were being squeezed to death by their own army. This was the moment the battle turned from a fight into a massacre. The English archers, who had run out of arrows, saw the French struggling. The knights were stuck in the mud, exhausted, unable to move their arms. The archers dropped their bows. They didn't have swords. They had the tools of their trade, heavy lead mallets used to hammer in stakes, hatchets, and long knives. They were light. They wore no armour, just leather jerkins and hose. They could move in the mud where the knights could not. They swarmed out from behind their stakes like a pack of wolves attacking a trapped herd. It was a clash of classes. The noble French knight, trained for years in the art of chivalric duelling, found himself face down in the dirt, unable to stand, while a peasant beat him to death with a hammer. It was brutal, unglamorous, and efficient. The archers knocked the knights down, flipped open their visors, and stabbed them in the face or neck. The French knights were terrified. This wasn't how war was supposed to be. You were supposed to capture a noble and ransom him, not beat him like cattle. But the English weren't playing by the rules of chivalry. They were fighting for survival. The piles of bodies grew so high that the English fought from on top of them. The wall of French dead became a rampart. The French rearguard, seeing the slaughter at the front, seeing the invincible vanguard being butchered by peasants, began to lose their nerve. The sheer volume of the French army, once their greatest strength, had become their tomb. They were trapped in the funnel, unable to fight, unable to flee, waiting their turn to die. By midday, the main battle was effectively over. Thousands of French prisoners had been taken. The English were exhausted, leaning on their bloody weapons, guarding groups of surrendered knights that outnumbered them. And then, a moment of controversy occurred that historians argue about to this day. Henry received word that a new French force was gathering to attack his rear. At the same time, the local French lord attacked the English baggage train, stealing the king's crown jewels and swords. Henry, fearing that the thousands of prisoners would pick up weapons and join the attack, gave a cold, ruthless order. "Kill the prisoners!" The English knights refused. It was against their code of honor, and it was burning money. A live prisoner was worth a fortune in ransom. A dead one was worthless. So, Henry ordered a group of 200 archers to do the dirty work. They moved through the groups of kneeling surrendered knights and began systematically executing them. Throats were cut, heads were smashed. It was a grim, bloody business. When the French realized the English were willing to kill every last hostage rather than lose the battle, the remaining French forces melted away. The attack on the rear never came. The slaughter stopped. But the message had been sent. This was total war. As the sun set over Agincourt, the silence returned. The field was a graveyard of the French aristocracy. The Constable of France was dead. 3 dukes were dead. 5 counts and 90 barons were dead. Over 5,000 noble knights lay in the mud. And the English, they had lost perhaps 400 or 500 men. The Duke of York was dead, crushed to death in the melee, but the army was intact. They had achieved the impossible. They had faced the greatest army in Europe and wiped it from the face of the earth. Think thought of the golden spurs the French had brought to the battle. They were never used. The wine they brought to celebrate was drunk by the English victors. The cart meant to carry the captured English king was used to carry the English wounded. But the story of Agincourt is not just about arrows and mud. It is about what happens when a rigid, top-down system faces a flexible, motivated force. The French failed because they refused to adapt. They clung to the old ways. They believed that war was a matter of mass and money. They thought that because they were the great power, victory was their birthright. They ignored the reality of the ground beneath their feet. They ignored the technological shift that the longbow represented, and they paid the ultimate price. This battle broke the back of the French resistance for a generation. It allowed Henry IV to marry the French king's daughter and be named heir to the throne of France. For a brief moment, England and France were united under one crown. Of course, Henry would die of dysentery just 7 years later, and the English would eventually lose all their French territories. But the legend of Agincourt remained. It became the foundational myth of English identity, the band of brothers. The idea that a small group of free men standing together can defeat any tyranny, no matter how powerful. However, there is one final layer to this story, a layer that connects the muddy fields of 1415 directly to the burning steppes of the 21st century. Because history, as they say, has a habit of rhyming. The parallels are impossible to ignore. When we look at Agincourt, we see the blueprint of a conflict that feels eerily familiar to us today. We see an imperial power convinced of its own greatness, invading with a force that looks impressive on paper, but is rotten at its core. The French army was vast, yes, but it was a lumbering beast. It was weighed down by its own history, its rigid hierarchy, and its refusal to innovate. The commanders were chosen by birthright, not by merit. They were more interested in looting and personal glory than in coordinated strategy. They looked at their enemy and saw something lesser. They saw peasants. They saw a nation they believed did not deserve to exist as an independent power. Does this sound familiar? It should. The French knights are the perfect historical analogue to the Second Army of the world. Myth we see shattering in Ukraine today. Just like the French at Agincourt, the modern aggressor relies on the doctrine of mass. Throw enough bodies, enough tanks, enough iron at the problem, and the enemy will break. It is a strategy born of arrogance. It assumes that quantity has a quality all its own. It assumes that the enemy will be terrified simply by the sight of the banners approaching. But Agincourt proves that technology and motivation act as a force multiplier that can negate sheer numbers. The English longbow was the HIMARS of the 15th century. It was a weapon that changed the geometry of the battlefield. It allowed a smaller force to strike from a distance, to disrupt the enemy's logistics, in this case, their horses, and to break their formations before they could even engage. Just as the longbow required a lifetime of training and a society built around its use, modern warfare requires a society that is adaptable, educated, and decentralized. The English archers could think for themselves. When they ran out of arrows, they didn't wait for orders from a duke. They grabbed hammers and attacked. They took initiative. Contrast this with the French knights, who were paralyzed in the crush, waiting for someone else to tell them what to do, or pushing blindly forward because that was the only command they knew. We see this same dynamic today. One side fights with a top-down, rigid command structure where initiative is punished and lying to superiors is the norm. The other side fights with a network of decentralized units using commercial drones, crowdfunding supplies, and adapting tactics in real time. One side is fighting for the emperor's ego, the other is fighting for the survival of their homes. The mud of Agincourt is the mud of Donbass. The terrain acts as the great equalizer. It strips away the advantage of heavy machinery. It forces the giant to come down to the level of the underdog. And in that mud, the lighter, faster, smarter fighter wins. The French defeat wasn't just a bad day at the office. It was a systemic failure. It exposed that their entire way of war, and indeed their entire social structure, was obsolete. The age of the invincible armored knight was ending. The age of the common soldier was beginning. Similarly, the conflicts of today are exposing that the old models of imperial conquest are dead. You cannot simply march a column of tanks toward a capital city and expect surrender. Not when every peasant has a weapon that can destroy a tank. Not when the rabble has a stronger will to fight than the elite. Henry IV is often remembered as a warrior king, but his greatest genius was understanding the human element. He knew his men were tired. He knew they were afraid. But he turned that fear into a weapon. He made them feel that they were part of something exclusive, something holy. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. He elevated the common archer to the status of a hero. He gave them a stake in the outcome. The French nobles, on the other hand, treated their own soldiers with contempt. They pushed their crossbowmen out of the way. They rode over their own infantry. An army that despises its own people will eventually be destroyed by them or by an enemy that respects human potential. So, when we look back at the 25th of October 1415, we shouldn't just see a medieval brawl. We should see a validation of a timeless truth. Empires are not destroyed from the outside. They are destroyed by their own weight, their own arrogance, and their refusal to see the world as it is, rather than how they want it to be. The French learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. They brought golden spurs to a mud fight, and they paid for it with the destruction of their entire ruling class. Victory belongs to the adaptable. Victory belongs to the motivated. And victory belongs to those who understand that iron and steel are useless without the spirit to wield them effectively. That is the legacy of Agincourt. And it is a legacy that is being rewritten in fire and steel right now, before our very eyes. The field of Agincourt is quiet now. The mud has long since turned back to grass, and the bones of the French nobility have returned to the earth. But the echo of that day still rings out. It reminds us that no army is invincible, no empire is eternal, and no aggressor, no matter how well armored or how confident, is safe from the determination of a free people defending their existence. History is not a dusty book of dates and names. It is a mirror. When we look into the face of the English archer, shivering in the cold but standing his ground, we see the reflection of every underdog who ever dared to say no to a tyrant. When we look at the French knight drowning in his own armour, we see the inevitable fate of hubris. The weapons change. The longbow gives way to the drone. The plate armour gives way to the tank. But the rules remain the same. Arrogance kills. Adaptability survives. And the spirit of a nation is the one weapon that no amount of steel can ever defeat. If you enjoyed this journey into the past and want to see more history that refuses to be forgotten, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Indomitable History. We have many more stories to tell. And before you go, I have a question for you. The longbow was the game changer of 1415. What do you think is the longbow of the modern battlefield? What single piece of technology is redefining war today? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay indomitable.